No extra credit though. All right, there's no extra credit. It's like who's buying? The more practical scholars.
To be sharing this research on Coast Salish homelands of the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. A state-sanctioned premature death continues at a relentless pace. Native nations remind us of the long history of ongoing genocide to land and peoples. We hope that our acknowledgement of Native presence, sovereignty, can guide us towards life-affirming relations with how we, as scholars, conduct research on Indigenous lands. To this, we ask, how might our knowledge practices on our Indigenous nations in the affirmation of life? We begin this task of insisting on life through a desire-centered framework that rejects the spectacle of unacknowledged and organized premature death that absolves white liberal institutions from their responsibility towards the ever-growing unsheltered community. We learned 2 years ago in this room that liberatory futures require a community of advocates, including artists, dreamers, and organizers dedicated to building capacities of care in as many spaces as possible. A dear friend and lifelong defender of the unsheltered community, Scott Murrow, recently passed away while in pursuit of this practice. Scott dedicated his life insisting on the life and livelihoods of the unsheltered community. We hope to honor him and the countless others who have dedicated their lives to the unsheltered community. We thank them for helping to see otherwise possibilities of care and collectivity. It is this spirit that shapes the Portrait Project and our talk today. The Portrait Project invites us to see what otherwise is ignored, intentionally made forgotten, and made abstract. Throughout our time together this afternoon, we will highlight what the Portrait Project and the unsheltered teach us and what it helps us see instead.
Thanks, Lawson. Because we're co-authors, this is what we do. We talk together and we share the presentation. It's thoroughly co-authored, but this is a practice we've long pursued. So bear with us while we do this. So I wanted to be clear that our talk today is not a policy talk. It's not a talk that engages with liberal poverty knowledge. Rather, our goal is to invite you through this talk and this story to imagine otherwise, to imagine beyond, and also beyond the ways in policy reproduces the status quo. Our work is a collaboration with our activist colleagues at Real Change News, and our goal today is to amplify their work and their commitment to public education. Our talk invites you to consider the political possibilities of the transformation of urban life through an analysis that is desire-centered, not damage-centered. An analysis that imagines otherwise. Otherwise meaning beyond the current policies and politics that often ignore, criminalize, or sweep people who are living outside, sustaining the practices that lead to their premature death. Our project, as Catherine McKittrick inspires us, and here I want to credit Olivia Orozco for bringing this wonderful quote to my attention through her wonderful MA work. Catherine McKittrick inspires us to contribute to repair in our work by producing knowledge that begins from the fundamental humanity of everybody. So our shift in focus is from critique and towards imagining otherwise. And we argue that this matters because as the movement for Black lives, as public intellectuals like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Cornel West, and Bell Hooks remind us, Current systems are not faulty or flawed in the sense that they are working exactly as intended. Persistent poverty is a structural and permanent feature of racial capitalism. It's not an aberration. It's a permanent feature of settler colonialism and of liberal urban governance. Our housing market, our urban development politics, our systems of policing, and our healthcare system, among others, all reproduce houselessness. It's not that the houses are falling off the edges, the system reproduces them. I'm going to say just a little bit of context for the portrait project itself now. Seattle-King County, as you may know, has the third highest population of unsheltered people in the country, despite the fact the city is the 15th largest. So it's a massive disproportionality there. Seattle is a deeply segregated city, and it has repeatedly reinvented itself and its residential form and its developmental imaginary explicitly for capital accumulation in ways that have systematically and repeatedly removed unsheltered people. These waves of reinvention have included the focus in the past on an identity around trade and manufacturing, think the port, think Boeing, then to a sort of cultural capital reimagination of the downtown, where it was a sort of residential and a leisure and a shopping place to go to. Then as a space, ironically or not ironically, South Lake Union was a space that was a dense concentration of services for people unsheltered. Then it got reimagined as a center for philanthropy, a center for global health, now a center for tech capital. Each wave of reimagination of the city and the politics that accompanied it has involved removal of racialized and impoverished people from neighborhoods and downtown spaces. This has been accomplished through criminalization, through property speculation and removal, and through ongoing cultural projects of othering that frame them as undeserving, dangerous, criminal, and unwelcome. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So our talk emerges from a long-term collaboration with Real Change News. To name some of our terrific partners at Real Change, Tim Harris and John Williams, who are both now standing up a new regional street paper called Dignity News. Tiffany McCoy, Anitra Freeman, Wes Browning, and Lena Cozy were crucial to, why don't we go back to the portraits if we could, just hit P. Perfect. So Real Change News is a street newspaper, and it's a broader advocacy coalition working for economic and social and racial justice. So selling the newspaper creates low barrier employment for low income people, many of whom have been or are houseless. Real Change is committed to working for the survival, agency, and voice of unsheltered people who have experienced houselessness. The Portrait Project is a collection of more than 30 portraits. You're seeing some of them here. It was started about a decade ago by Tim Harris and John Williams as one of Real Change's public education projects. So volunteer artists and Real Change vendors worked together to create original portraits of the vendors. And then Real Change staff and volunteers co-wrote biographies of the vendors' lives with them. The biographies are always displayed with the portraits. The full collection has exhibited all over the region, really, mostly not in art galleries. It's been in spaces like bars, coffee shops. It showed in Seattle City Hall, and then the UW installation at Suzzallo right outside where we are. Installations of the Portrait Project are intended to be an opportunity for residents of Seattle to see the breadth, the complexity, the beauty of the lives of Real Change vendors. And at the same time, it's a chance for them to learn from the vendor biographies about some of the forms of structural oppression that shape their lives through their own words and experiences. It's important for us to shout out to the undergrads in Vicky's honors class in winter of 2020. They were utterly vital partners in imagining and implementing the installation that we did here. They made some of the crucial curation choices in close consultation with us, with Real Change, and each other. What are the materials that should support the exhibit in display cases? How should we design it to signal dispossession? How to signal that houselessness is an enduring part of Seattle's present and past. It's not something that's exceptional or episodic. And further, what are the visual clues that might help viewers recognize the premature death to which folks who live outdoors are exposed? So the exhibit focuses, it really visually, it centers the beauty, the dignity, the humanity, and the full lives of vendors. And in that, it's intended to intervene in prevailing understandings of houselessness. In the US and many other rich countries, those narratives are steeped in sort of toxic meanings, toxic liberal poverty knowledge that you're familiar with. This is all around us in the media, in popular culture, in policy debates. You know, you experience it as the stigmatization of impoverished and houseless people, as lazy, criminal, dirty. Visual media, like artworks, like documentary photography, are part of that. You know, they shape the way that houselessness is perceived and how visual media representing houselessness is interpreted. That's the idea of a visual regime. So a visual regime is a socially constituted frame that shapes how we see and understand images. And the widespread circulation of images of unsheltered people reiterates some of these discursive messages that signify unsheltered people as devalued, disposable, isolated. Yep, thank you. Those are the kinds of messages that sort of are reinforced through imagery like the one you're seeing here. Unsheltered people are depicted over and over again, alone, with crates or shopping carts, sleeping, lying on the sidewalks. This is a representational tactic that reduces people to visual signals of their unsheltered status. You know, it renders them out of relation. Importantly, there's a lot of work by visual studies scholars that reminds us that visual regimes are not just an abstract thing. They are racialized, they're gendered, they're sort of situated in class politics, and that they're negotiated through racist and sexist categories and ideologies. So, you know, notions of beauty in a society, whether applied to people or places in the US, tend to be coded around whiteness, around conformity to heteronormative gender binaries, middle classness, and so on. Houselessness gets visually produced as other to those things, as you see in there, and we'll just move on so as not to sit there on reinforce the stuff by sitting on it.
Yep.
With that sort of context, we think it's important to explicitly name the normative visual regime. You know, we talk about it as a white liberal visual regime, and it is the dominant way that viewers experience and interpret social and spatial meanings to do with visual imagery on homelessness. You know, it's a regime that's sort of socially produced and shapes a lot of not just societal responses, but things like policy. You know, this sort of visual stigmatization, devaluation is wrapped up in justifying removal, governance, surveillance, violent policing, and a lot more. And importantly, the white liberal visual regime is also really steeped in capitalist logics. The sort of logics that turn land into property, or art and everything else into property and relations of exchange. So a great example of that is every time the Portrait Project has exhibited, our colleagues at Real Change tell us that someone asks them how they can buy a painting. So the paintings are explicitly, intentionally not for sale, more on that later, but the fact that the viewers can only see artwork as something to be bought and owned, that it reveals something important about an element of the visual regime. So having said that, it's important to see that visual regimes condition, but do not determine how we see and understand images. These are socially constructed ideas. They can be reconstructed. And that's exactly what the Portrait Project tries to do. You'll see that in this quote from Tim Harris, where he says the Portrait Project prompts people to see something that goes against stereotypes in such a big way. It opens up new ways of thinking about homelessness. It opens up a lot of questions that can wake folks up, make them aware of inequalities. So the Portrait Project is trying to intervene in how viewers are predisposed to perceive people living without shelter. It's a way as an entry to prompting new ways of understanding the shelter crisis. And that starts from the portraits themselves, which in every way push back some of the toxic narratives. We've got Addis Michael Jr. here just beaming with unbridled joy. Kathmandu Jack, he's holding his beloved dog. This dog is family to him. He is loving and being loved. Sabina Lopez, we see the things she hopes for in the future: biking, chickens, a GED. And the portrait, she's highlighting her family relations as a daughter, as a wife, as a mom. She's emplaced. She's in Fremont. And I love the way she's crowned with flowers and stars in this portrait. I'm not going to reiterate the toxic stuff, but you will clearly get the way that these kinds of representational tactics push back some of that other stuff. And then in addition to the portraits themselves, the vendor bios are also challenging liberal poverty knowledge. The vendors point out structural causes of homelessness, things like a lack of affordable housing, lack of health care, the disappearance of living wage employment. They talk about interconnections between houselessness and dispossession, racial violence, and premature death. And we designed the installation of the Portrait Project here to further emphasize some of those arguments and try to keep them in view in how the exhibit was designed. So on multiple levels, it works against liberal poverty knowledge and tries to shift how largely privileged housed people who saw the exhibit understand and learn from it. But the white liberal visual regime is hard to interrupt. It is a powerful thing. More on that from Vicki.
Thanks, Sarah. So Sarah's given you a bit of a travel through the exhibit itself. And so what we did when we mounted the exhibit and when students were taking people through the exhibit, we invited everybody who viewed it to fill out a very brief survey at the end, because both ourselves and Real Change and the vendors were very curious about what, if any, impact this exhibit had on disrupting the way they were understanding impoverishment, and whether it was challenging any of the norms and toxicity that we've been talking about. And those questions were very simple, and I can't actually paraphrase them, but it was to the effect of, what struck you about the exhibit? Did this in any way change your thinking? And what actions would you like to take? Literally 3 questions. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how people did respond and whether or not they were shaped by the experience of going through the exhibit. as Sarah has indicated, the exhibit itself is explicitly curated to emphasize the humanity and the complexity of the vendors, to allow people to learn about the structural oppressions they experienced in their lives through their own biographies and stories. And also, we intentionally curated the exhibit in a way that was intended to prompt these sorts of learnings. So you can pop the next one up. So for example, we wanted to amplify the message that there isn't an emergency or a crisis of houselessness in this city, but that it is a chronic and persistent feature of our city and the way that it's evolved. So part of how we did this was with this wonderful exhibit, which is a set of historical photographs matched with photographs now in the city. And the historical pictures are from Hooverville in the 30s, from the 1960s in the Kingdom, and all the way up to the 70s and the 80s. And so viewers were invited to see this long history because there are houseless bodies present all through that history. And also through placing up the waterlines map, which is a map that shows Indigenous settlement and usage of waterways and places to live. And so there was something very explicit about, here's a history, this is not a current issue. We also curated, and we means the students actually in large part, curated the exhibit to really highlight the devastating reality that for people who are houseless, they suffer from extraordinarily high levels of premature death. For instance, since 2012, when the portraits were begun, to the time of the exhibit, which was 2020, 30% of the vendors had died. And many of them were in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. So that there was something very clear. And so what we did was we clustered together the portraits of those who had passed and added a little bouquet. And also the biography itself talked about the fact that those vendors had passed. So we invited people to see premature death. But in addition to that, the portraits visually represent the diversity of people who live on the streets, and also the overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. So all of this was, if you will, in plain sight. So then what do people see? Well, viewers were prompted to shake up their knowing a little bit. Some of the most toxic aspects of the white liberal visual regime were challenged. For instance, many people challenged their own assumptions that houselessness is a choice, or it was caused by laziness or mental illness or addiction. Many people challenged that idea. Viewers began to show limited new understandings that houselessness has structural and historical causes. We heard repeatedly people said, people end up without a home because of jobs, work-related issues, injuries at work. People end up without a home because of healthcare costs, or because they just can't make enough money. Or people end up without a home because of rising housing costs. So there was some disruption. There was some complication of the way the liberal regime wants us to think about houselessness. There was an invitation and an acceptance of the broader humanity of the people in the exhibit. Many of the viewers referred to the vendors as beautiful, as having loving hearts, as having dreams, of being smart, of having bravery. So there was, again, a really rich reading of the humanity of people. Others understood people living outdoors. They expressed surprise that they had families, that they had children, that they had parents, that they weren't able to be with their families, and started to sort of re-place them in the social world. So there was some disruption of those toxic narratives. However, the survey also showed some deep limits in what viewers could understand. Most of the viewers did not engage the questions of dispossession, the displacement from land, gentrification, removal of people. They did not engage with premature death. Across 100 survey responses, in fact, only one person noticed the premature death that was represented in the exhibit, despite the ways that we tried to highlight that. So the way we've interpreted these survey results is that viewers responded to the exhibit with an ambivalent gaze. It wasn't uncritical. But what we see is that they were able to navigate between a sort of modest acknowledgement that there is unequal vulnerability, but a comfortable and largely innocent subject position. Seeing through that white liberal visual regime allowed them to ignore racism, to ignore white supremacy and land dispossession, and in that ignoring, to reaffirm their sort of white comfortability. We see this, for example, in a lot of responses that said, well, you know, homelessness could happen to anybody. It's a matter of chance. Or viewers that said, we're all the same, really, revealing a profound ignorance. Vulnerability to houselessness is not equally distributed, and racialization is the technology through which that differential vulnerability is reproduced. These responses, again, remind us of the power of the white liberal visual regime. So some openings, but some refusal to go deep. And I shouldn't really use the word refusal in that context. Tim Harris, the founder of Real Change, and John Williams, the curator of this exhibit, are not naive to this complexity. But they do insist that prompting relatively privileged people to engage richly with the humanity of people living outside is a non-trivial first step. But more than this, they think it can be generative. A way to, Tim says, a humanizing emotional experience perhaps can serve as a doorway to discomfort, to disrupting the white liberal visual regime, a powerful opening onto other realizations. And that's where we take our analysis next.
At the heart of this project is the politics of refusal. We want to highlight some of these sites, moments, and actions of refusal. Eve Tuck and Marcia McKenzie argue that refusal is not just a no, it is an invitation to imagine and enact otherwise. This refusal invites us to think outside these very limits that we have just discussed from the survey. I'm going to talk about some of these examples of refusal. So one component that refusal happens is an insistence on survival, a pivot to survival. So one component that Real Change does this is to create low barrier entry for their vendors. This is an act of refusal. Another component that is important to highlight here is the practice of mutual aid. Real Change is very much engaging in a mutual aid project, including matters of health, sanitation, and food, and through other means. Another huge important thing that we want to highlight here that the Portrait Project does and insists upon is to insist on a politics of presence and visibility, insisting on the presence of the unsheltered is an act of refusal. Another component that Real Change helps us think through is to insist on life in the here and now. Through the creation of these mutual aid networks, Real Change is teaching us of the importance of addressing the material needs of the unsheltered peoples here and right now. Where white supremacy and white liberal regimes destroy the possibility of relationality, Real Change through the Portrait Project insists on life through care networks. Real Change through the Portrait Project helps us reimagine otherwise life-affirming institutions despite their very real entanglements. So to conclude our presentation with you all, we have an image here by Nisha and Jacqueline. These are individuals that work with the Women in Black and with Real Change. And so the women in black, real change, Tim and John, we're so thankful for them. They teach us to insist on life. They teach us to insist on collectivity, on care, our responsibilities with each other to change the state of affairs. They help us see.
Are you navigating questions through the chat? Sure. What's your practice? Over the room?
I noticed you had one more slide on initiative 135. Do you want to tell us about that?
We figured if we got asked about it in the Q&A, we would.
Can I ask you about it?
Absolutely. So our first question out of the gate, Amy would like to hear more about I-135.
Excellent.
Indeed.
So Amy, yeah, we included the slide because we wanted to point to ways in which people can be involved in the here and now. And the latest iteration of this class on houselessness collaborated again with Real Change. And this time Real Change asked us to be involved in bringing public education, public attention to this current initiative in the city, I-135. And it's an initiative to invite us collectively to build social housing. And the idea here is not low barrier housing, it's not housing first, it's a different model. Most fundamentally, a model of housing that is outside of the market. It's a model of housing that is funded through public funds, but into a public development authority that is not governed by the city, but it's governed by people. The model is one in which the residents of a building would not pay market rents. They would pay the money it costs to maintain the building, each according to their means. And so it's a radical departure from the way we've thought about bringing people into housing, which is don't change the market, just try to subsidize people into the market. And of course, people with housing vouchers are the last people to get access to rental space. So I-135 is a coalition built between Real Change and several other groups in the city called House Our Neighbors is the name of the coalition. And again, in this very room, we held a public event this last quarter to launch the initiative, which is now in the signature gathering stage. And it's an example of how Real Change is thinking about collectivity, presence, thinking outside the frames of liberal knowledge like the market, the housing market, the rental market. And so this is an example of the kind of work people could be doing.
Thank you, Vicki, for that. Also, thank you, Isaac, for raising the name of Scott Moreau today. I really appreciate that. I think one of his real contributions in this whole area was developing these self-governed entities where people could make collective well-being. And also at the same time, develop their political power and make homelessness more visible. You know, part of the purpose, I think, of the tent cities and Nicholsville's tiny house villages was to be a visible presence of both mutual aid and homelessness all at the same time. Remarkable effort. Questions, people in the room or online? I'll look at the chat. Or if you're online, just speak up. I think we'll be able to hear you.
When they're not being exhibited somewhere, they hang in the Real Change offices in Pioneer Square downtown.
Although they went home. They
Oh,
went home
that's
to John.
right. They
Yeah.
went back to John's house.
So the story of the physical artifacts was the story of COVID. The exhibit was due to run into finals week in winter of 2020. And when we learned that campus would close, we literally scrambled and chunked, we got all the portraits out of Allen Library and into John's truck. And from there, they went to his home. And now that John and Tim are starting a new enterprise in Tacoma called Dignity City, it may be that the portraits will travel in that space. We're not really sure, but they did hang in Real Change for a long time. But John, who was the sort of creator of the exhibit, and Tim want those portraits in public. But the thing that was important about them coming into the public here was that it was done explicitly with a pedagogy. It was done with explicit engagement of young people. And all of the young people that were part of building the exhibit were also asked to were asked to guide people through the exhibit and talk about it with the advantage, thank you, that they had been learning a structural critique of homelessness in my class that quarter. So it was really explicitly educational. And my hope is that that will happen again somewhere soon.
Seeing no more questions online, let me ask one more. So, Vicki, you were always really intentional about bringing homelessness into the honors program, educational activities. Do you want to speak what the future of that will be, since you insist on retiring?
The future is always unwritten. I'm hopeful that they'll invite me back to teach the class in the future. There's a possibility I might teach the class in geography. The model is there. Isaac was deeply involved, and will take his work forward, and it will have visual politics in it. I think the idea of teaching is the idea of multiplying, and hopefully there are a lot of people now out there inspired to do this kind of work in their own way. So I think there are many answers to your question.
Okay, good.
And I'll speak for geography and just say the welcome back is out.
Oh, good. And I have enjoyed having my students collaborate with Vicki's in previous years. I know Tent City 3 will be welcomed back to the UW campus in winter of 23. They're going to be occupying the parking lot next to the Waterfront Activities Center, which will give them a nice view of the water, but also open to the wind. So that's the way that will go. Yes, question.
I'm curious from you how you would like to see the university more engaged in this question of homelessness. I mean, it's kind of a big question, but what are the ways beyond students caring for projects? Is there a commitment you're hoping for? Does this issue?
So just to boil your question down, how do we keep the UW engaged in homelessness? We have so many resources and so many interested people, and yet at a high level, the university has made only modest contributions in this area. I think through Urban at UW and CSDE, there has been some work. Yeah, thoughts about that?
Well, here's one idea. How might this campus welcome and engage, because it is a well-resourced public space? How might we welcome and support unsheltered folks, not just sort of in a single quarter of hosting Tent City under the city's MOU? I think about the ways in which this campus has long been the public space for unsheltered youth who live in the U District, and their more usual experience of being excluded from buildings,
Chased out of the hub.
exactly, pressured by campus police and other people. How can we? That strikes me as a top level thing to address.
Yeah, I would add, there's some wonderful work by a scholar by the name of Rivera and Baldwin, who looks at the behavior of the University of Chicago as a landlord and as a land grabber within the city, specifically on the Chicago South Side, in predominantly Black communities. UW has a story to tell there, and the institution is not reflexive. So there's these deep contradictions. On the one hand, isn't this a cool exhibit? And isn't this a cool pedagogy? And, yay, do that work, or your work on the tent cities being on campus. But there's another layer, which is to speak as if the institution was really deeply willing to be accountable and yet being utterly unaccountable in the ways that you describe, and more broadly in terms of how the transformation of the university district, which will inevitably continue and continues to displace, just like South Lake Union used to be a services hub. Look at it now, it's unrecognizable. And it's the massive displacements, not just of humans, but of the things they needed. I think we're looking at that now in the U district. It's a matter of time. And where is that coalition? And where is that work?
Yes, if you look at the UW master plan, there is a lot of master narrative around big alliances with Google and other very highly placed tech companies who will build buildings here that will collaborate with our academic enterprise.
I think this gets back at the refusing the category of criminal or unsheltered relatives here on campus. UW to insist on there's a campaign talks on campus. That's a huge component to the decriminalization. And I think we also have to work interdisciplinary. It's really great that this is hosted in the School of Public Health. Thank you so much. I think there are some avenues that could open up. I think this requires serious internal conversation and reflection amongst our disciplinary practices and what we wish to emphasize.
No, just yes, that's what the honors is trying to be. It's that kind of space. Yeah, exactly. I think that's so important. Break those boundaries, ask the big questions, and then reflect.
Thank you for prompting that. The purpose of this series was to hold up the colleagues we have noticed around campus who are doing this work. And everyone can find recordings of the previous sessions on our CHIPS website. Last month, we had Graham Pruce come, who got his PhD in anthropology here to talk about the number of people who live in vehicles and how they go about leading those lives in a way that's possible in a city that likes to remove anything that's parked and is a home to people. I see the city just resumed its 72-hour parking limit across the board. And so these vehicles will start to be towed and removed from our neighborhoods now. The sweeps have certainly escalated in recent weeks.
I noticed sort of some really visible action against those removals. I live in West Seattle, and there's an area where RVs have been peacefully living their lives for 2 years now. I think the pressure has begun, and the RVs are now systematically have sort of signage on them that says, don't tell my home, valued members of our community live here. I'm sorry to see the pressure begin again. I'm glad to see that.
Mutual aid organizations are really stepping up and printing off those flyers and bringing resources to people that they sure could use more help. There's a website called Stop the Sweeps people can go to find more information. Let's see if there's more here online. Somebody says, thank you so much for this presentation. It is a beautiful project. My voice is harsh, so trying to chat my question in. After finding out that only one person acknowledged premature death and folks did not notice displacement, curious if ideas came to mind on what else you might test out to try to acknowledge these things if you do feature exhibits in the future on homelessness.
Such a great question. I really appreciate that question. As we thought about where the project could go from here, I'll speak for us, but feel free to edit me. We thought about always having the exhibit along with a pedagogy of whatever kind, whether that be the way in which it's launched and explained going in, whether that be pairing it with another class in the future or classes, whether it be workshops designed with the portrait project. We think that for the portrait project itself to go deeper, it would need to be coupled with these deeper histories and with some talking, discussion, and discovery together around the structural forces that produce houselessness.
There's one more question asking about what percentage of people are estimated to be veterans who are homeless. I don't know that precise number, but I do know that veterans are disproportionately represented among the homeless.
Now, I don't remember the number either, but you're right, Amy.
Yeah, including those who are students on this campus.
Yeah. That's easily Googleable, although who knows how accurate that number is. There's a group of us trying to do a study on evictions in relation to homelessness. And we'll be tracking the veteran experience of eviction particularly.
And you know, makes me think a lot about disability, as in not necessarily connected to being a veteran, but the disproportionality for disabled persons being unsheltered is extraordinarily.
All right, well, we're up against 1 o'clock, so thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our speakers for coming, and I look forward to future collaborations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a long time. Oh my goodness. Yes, I have time. The farm is good. Well, I get benefit from your a year old. I think that's the face that said she would need to come in.
Thank you. Glad you came. Yeah, good. Thank you. It was nice of you to come. Good.
She came out to ride